Good afternoon and welcome to today's caregiver webinar, Best Practices When You Are Chosen to Manage Someone Else's Money. My name is Allegra Jaffe. I am a social service specialist with the Caregiver and Supportive Service Unit with the Fairfax Area Agency on Aging. Before I introduce today's speaker, I will go over a few housekeeping items. We have enabled closed captioning if you need it. You can enable those closed captionings on your Zoom panel. Today's presentation is being recorded, and a recording will be sent to all the registrants a week from today. Also, we will do some Q&A at the end of the session, so you can type in your questions in the Q&A button box throughout the presentation. And lastly, there will be a brief survey as you sign out. So please take a moment to fill out that survey because it does help us create programs that are relevant and important to our caregiving community. And now it's my pleasure to share with you about today's speaker, Tom West. Thomas C. West is a senior partner in SEIA's Virginia office. Tom has a robust wealth management practice that emphasizes cash flow in all stages of retirement, with an emphasis on planning and asset management for families facing the challenges of health-related dependency due to disability, illness, or death. Tom also has significant experience in issues related to suitable and ethical financial strategies pertaining to incapacitated seniors. Tom has been in the investment management and insurance business for over 25 years. He has also published multiple times in peer-reviewed professional journals on best wealth management practices involving seniors facing health-related dependency. Tom is the creator of Life Care Affordability Plan, a proprietary healthcare and financial planning offering from SEIA. Tom regularly educates financial professionals, attorneys, tax professionals, and geriatric care managers on the most appropriate financial planning techniques for families facing long-term care decisions. Tom, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today. We are looking forward to your information. Thank you. Tom, I think you're muted. There we go. Still can't hear you, Tom, for some reason. Let's see. Now you're there.
Okay. All right. This is why we have the practice beforehand. Allegra, it's great to be here, and everybody, thanks for budgeting a little bit of your early afternoon for us. I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of where our presentation is going to be going. I'm going to be starting with what I would consider a lot of the nuts and bolts associated with best practices, and then about halfway through the program, because I'm expecting about 45 minutes worth of prepared comments, I'm going to be spending the latter part of the program with, gosh, it's awfully hard. Aside from the particulars about, organizing money and whatnot, how is it really that I need to think about the stresses and the anxieties associated with managing money for a loved one when, perhaps I might not know how long they might live or what kind of care or assistance they might need. And I think the tail end of this is really going to be to try to put people in the audience in a more confident posture to being able to think that, look, they can reach out, they can ask for help. And I want to compliment everybody that's starting off. You're taking time to get better information, to look for resources. So I appreciate very much everybody's attendance. So let's get started. I'm going to be sharing my screen here, and Allegra did a wonderful job of introducing me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be skipping my bio because she made me feel great about myself. So thank you again, Allegra. I want to start for everybody using a word that sometimes you've seen in sort of the financial press, and the word is fiduciary. Fiduciary is sometimes, it seems to be an industry term of art, in the legal or the financial world. But it's one of the first concepts that if you have been chosen to manage money for somebody else in your family, it's really the first concept that kind of describes what's the standard of care that I need to take to make sure that everybody knows and I know that I'm doing right by the person that I'm managing the money for. So let's talk about a fiduciary. And some of these things are really coming right out of state statutes. So the first thing to know about a fiduciary are the set of duties that they have. Your responsibility managing the money of somebody else is to act only in the best interest of that person. Period. Full stop. You're not doing it for yourself. You're not doing it for somebody else. You're making sure that your conflict of interest is to a minimum because you're looking out for that person that you're stewarding the money for. Second responsibility is like, look, you got to do this carefully. You got to manage money and or property, with a keen eye, and you got to pay attention. There's certainly a standard where you can't just sort of phone it in and not do sort of a diligent job paying attention to things. Third responsibility is you got to keep money and you got to keep property separate from your own money and your own property. One of the responsibilities of being a fiduciary is not to commingle and to blend. And then the last one is you're supposed to keep good records. And in terms of money in, money out, and if you have to make decisions about expenses or transfers or things like that, always have a good paper trail. And it's not just for your own protection, your own liability. It's also mostly for the protection of the person whose money you're stewarding. So those 4 basic duties of a fiduciary, you want to start off with saying like, okay, generally speaking, this is how the rules of managing somebody else that the courts, that the health system, that I think families are coming to expect in terms of making sure that things are appropriately managed. There's different kinds of fiduciaries. So for those of you in the audience that have been chosen to manage money for somebody else, it could be for a variety of different sort of legal documents or proceedings. You might be an agent that's named in a power of attorney. You might be a trustee that's been nominated in a revocable living trust. You might be a representative payee or somebody that works with the Veterans Affairs Agency as a fiduciary. Or you could find yourself in this position of responsibility, have proceeding. Guardian, remember, is really zeroing in on healthcare decisions, and conservator more on the property decision side of things. So with that being said, let's go into a little bit more detail on each of these as a place to start. Act only in the best interest of somebody else. So I'll give you sort of a true story, or sort of a summary of a bunch of true stories. So as Allegra was talking about, we serve a lot of families that are responsible for managing money for other folks. One of the first sort of areas of stress is, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. How do I know what I'm supposed to be doing? First piece of advice that really is new information for a lot of these families having this conversation for the first time is, hey, have you read the document? Have you read the power of attorney? Have you read the trust? Well, no, I haven't, but I really need to know what it says. Well, I mean, maybe you should pull it out and we should read it, and I can read it with you. The first thing is understanding when this power becomes effective. Is it as a date? Is it on a medical condition? Who's determining, whether or not the document that you have that gives you the authority to manage money for somebody else is really in effect? And first by what the actual document says. We talked about avoiding conflict of interest. You're only managing money for somebody else in particular. But you also, as part of the conflict of interest thing, you want to avoid changing plans that might have been made for the individual about giving away money or property. So we get a lot of questions about conflict of interest, and maybe mom had said in the past that there's an intent to give to a grandkid's college, to distribute money to a child or a friend or a charity, but they never really got around to doing it. So there's no history of actually giving stuff away. Keep in mind that that's something that I want you to be careful of. Avoid changing plans that haven't really been executed. There isn't a history of doing it. And the last piece, a lot of questions like, look, managing the money of somebody else might be a lot of work. Is there a way that I can pay myself? Hey, well, look, let's go back to the document. Is there specific permission that is given there that explicitly says, hey, whoever's serving as a fiduciary, as a trustee, as a conservator, as a power of attorney, do they have the ability to pay themselves? And you look first at what is the document itself that's giving you this authority. That's the place to look. Now, this gets a little bit, as I sort of foreshadowed, into, all right, well, how do I start organizing myself? Well, I always want to start with, well, what is it that you're supposed to be managing as a fiduciary, as a new decision maker on property? So, when in doubt, I always think a pretty good rule of thumb is write stuff down. So list and try to make it pretty organized, the money and the property and any debts that somebody is holding. Um, and take a look carefully at particularly property like a house or something like that, making sure that it continues to be protected. If there's sort of insurance that's being it's put on the place to be able to make sure that you hedge against some risks, make sure you keep those up. And I'm going to be spending a little bit of time talking about portfolios and investing. Make sure that if there are investments, that it's invested carefully. And I'll go into more detail on that in a minute. Pay bills and manage expenses. I mean, it sounds right, but a lot of times somebody that has to step into a role can be a little bit shell-shocked. They're not exactly sure where to start. Well, make sure you don't get behind on things, particularly areas where the person whose money you're managing owes money for bills or taxes or something along those lines. And I'll give you some tips on that in a second. And then lastly, make sure that if you really do have the authority to manage money on somebody's behalf, you got to take steps to get these documents accepted. So whether it's a brokerage account or a bank or something along those lines, if they're not accepting this particular authority that's been given to you, well, I mean, it doesn't help out too much. And it's fair to say that most financial institutions right now are run by attorneys that are worried about getting sued. So I say that saying that sometimes a bank, sometimes a brokerage, sometimes an insurance company will want to go through their internal steps to make sure that they recognize your authority. And there might be another set of forms that are coming out, attorneys in fact, and so on, that you'll have to navigate. Certainly, the best practice is have the stuff done beforehand. Make sure that the financial institutions who are housing funds for the person that you eventually are going to be managing, they already recognize who you are and what your authority is going to be. But take steps to make sure those documents get accepted. Keep money and property separate. I mean, this sounds pretty straightforward, but separate means separate from yours. This means specifically avoid joint accounts. Now, there might be some joint accounts that exist prior to you having to take responsibility to manage money for somebody else, but you definitely want to not do joint accounts after you are accepting that kind of authority. Keep money and property titled appropriately means don't change the ownership of stuff. You got to leave it kind of the way it is. It's part of your responsibility. And here's a little bit of a tip. Learn how to sign as an agent or a trustee. If you're going to be responsible for making financial decisions, you might have to, put your John Hancock on something. And different documents require different ways to sign. So things like Tom West, durable power of attorney for his incapacitated wife. That's not what you're saying. Tom West, durable power of attorney for Beth West, Elizabeth West. That's how I would sign on a power of attorney. Or Tom West, trustee, Elizabeth West Trust. That's how I would sign as a trustee. That basically, the way that you're doing that actual authorization, that sort of reinforces that you're not just a random person signing documents for somebody, that you've got a specific role that was granted to you in a legally binding agreement. The next piece that I want to talk about is good records. It sounds pretty straightforward. And a lot of times, a lot of electronic account statements and history sometimes can suffice, but keep a list of everything received and spent. And it's always a good policy to say, you can even keep the tiny receipts. Like, just make it a little rule that if I'm managing money for somebody else, I'm just gonna keep all the stuff in one place. You want to avoid cash transactions. I think that there's conflict of interest and there's the appearance of conflict of interest. And sometimes people using cash transactions, monies might look like they're not where they're supposed to be and they're hard to track. So I would always, if you can, go the route of checks or credit cards or any type of electronic commerce is sort of a place to start, because that makes the capture of some of that action, that history, a little bit easier for you as a record keeper. And if you're getting paid and the document explicitly says you can get paid, make sure that the charge is reasonable. Now, I get a lot of questions about, well, what's reasonable? It depends a little bit on sort of the size of the estate or the type of work that you're doing. Sometimes with folks that have more modest accounts and whatnot, having a modest hourly fee that you might be able to pay yourself, again, only if the document is allowing it. that might be more appropriate. If you're looking at managing larger estates, you're usually looking at a very small percentage of a larger estate if you're not doing it. But again, only if the document specifically allows that. So with that being said, and sort of some of these nuts and bolts, and I think so far it's been pretty straightforward, how do you really make decisions? And the reason I say how do you really make decisions is, look, we're talking about managing somebody else's money, but the decisions that people a lot of times have to make about money, they're not really about the money, they're about other stuff. They're about care needs, they're about changing housing situations, they're changing relationships and responsibilities in terms of family roles. And it's a lot of these non-financial issues, anxiety about how, if somebody can stay at home or if they can stay with a spouse. Those kinds of things can interrupt what might be a little bit more black and white instructions about best practices to manage people's money. So I want to spend a little bit of time exploring some of the more human challenges of managing money for somebody that is less able. And I think this is going to be hopefully making you feel a little bit like, all right, that sounds a little bit more like my situation. And I want to be giving you some good tips that you're on a good sound, firm footing when you try to move forward and helps the individual. So Eisenhower gave me this quote, plans are nothing, but planning is everything. What I want you to say of the situation, almost like a habit, like going to the gym. Your job isn't to, get on the elliptical machine for 20 minutes. Your job is to sort of regularly stay in shape. So what I'm going to be spending a little bit of time on is how planning is everything, how getting in a regular process can really help navigate some of sometimes the very personal peculiarities of your family situation. Different health, different personalities and whatnot. And how do you gain control of finances after a death or a disability, a big financial loss, a profound windfall, and so on. And there's some tried and true sort of approaches that I'm going to share with you that we're always recommending, and certainly our clients or families like we're teaching right now will come back to us after the fact and say, listen, that was really helpful. So without further ado, just by way of a reminder, how am I going to be making all these financial decisions if I don't know how long somebody's going to live? If I knew somebody that might have a critical illness was going to, for example, have a life expectancy of only 3 months, that is an entirely different set of decisions than somebody with dementia that might have a multi-year period of care. The idea that I don't know how long I'm going to be in this role, sometimes that inhibits effective decision making today. The second thing, which is adjacent to that, is not knowing how much help they're going to need, particularly if you're paying out of pocket for healthcare. And what I want all of us to recognize in ourselves is there's going to be a tendency to procrastinate because I don't have all the information that I need about how much help somebody's going to need or how long somebody's going to live. And I want you to recognize in yourself that there sometimes is a default setting in all of us where we want to procrastinate until information comes that might make information a little bit more clear. And everybody, what I'll share with you when you're managing money for somebody else, particularly for, some of the reality is we've got to make some decisions in ambiguity. Like we're not going to be exactly locked down sure about all of these things, but we still have to make a decision. So one piece of advice that I'll give you, try to make decisions as quickly as possible, particularly that's better than being shell-shocked and waiting for a circumstance to change that forces your hand to move in a particular direction. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next page. Another piece, which is a very human element to managing money for somebody else, is, okay, although I have this piece of paper that says, look, mom gave me the authority to make decisions on her behalf. Is that new role really accepted? Do I have siblings that are all kind of on board, or is there some conflict in terms of who's really in charge? The idea of accepting the authority that you've got, not specifically from the financial institutions, but the rest of the people that are in your life, that are in the senior's life that you're helping to manage for, do they accept your authority? I always try to set realistic expectations for everybody that we're talking about. and recognize also there's stress and associated with your new role. Now I get this new responsibility, and I can't just, you know, give myself permission to wing it like I could maybe with my own stuff. I've got this higher fiduciary standard of care. So how do I manage all of those pieces? It's also useful to remember that in this role you're in now, you know, do you have the right information? Do you have the time? Do you have the resources? Do you need to ask for help? And this next bullet that I've got, listen, sometimes it makes a whole lot of sense to be intentional about delegating. Appropriate to ask for help, maybe from other access with, if I ask for help, then I'm not really in control, but I can't stay in control because I can't do it all myself. So I need to ask for help. And sometimes that tension between loss of control or experiencing a feeling of loss of control, but I can't possibly do all this stuff myself, that sometimes causes people to procrastinate. The reason I'm giving voice to it is, you know, I'm all about trying to make people more effective decision makers. And if you don't address some of these human elements to some of the challenges, then, you know, decisions might be procrastinated longer than necessary. So the first place that I want to start with is, do you have to make any decisions right now? What decisions can I basically put off? What's responsible in terms of things that I have to address immediately? Well, I always say that sometimes it makes sense to look for a qualified guide. What's a qualified guide? These are people, whether they're professionals or other family members, that have been in a similar situation before. One of the realities of you know, managing money for somebody else or managing healthcare decisions for somebody else, if you haven't done it before, it's experienced as something very new and oftentimes pretty stressful. But you're not the first person that's had to manage money or healthcare decisions for somebody else. In fact, even though sometimes you might not have a whole lot of people to talk to share your experience, there's a lot of people that have walked your path beforehand. So the idea of identifying a qualified guide, whether it's somebody that's done this in your personal life or you're looking to engage different professionals, that might be one area in terms of a small step to take. Think about the responsibilities that you've got. Remember when I was talking about paying bills and making sure your authority is accepted by different institutions? Sometimes it's useful just to say, these are the actual jobs that I've got. I got to manage the Bank of America account. I got to make sure the Social Security goes this way. I got to pay these 3 bills. I got to keep the house up. Deal with these contractors or home health aides or whatever it ends up being. But sometimes listing out your actual responsibilities can be a little bit of a stress reliever, because you sort of range bound all of the different things that might be piling up, and it doesn't feel so ambiguous and indefinite. I'd also give you the advice, honestly, listen, be patient with yourself and with others, particularly those that might not accept that somebody might need the help that you're giving. And I think that idea of being patient with yourself, but do make decisions, make them conservatively. I always like, again, I'm going to repeat the advice. I'll say it again in a few minutes. Try to move quickly on making revocable decisions, meaning instead of making no decisions, try to make decisions that you can change your mind on, but get them moving, because those are the kinds of things that I think can best serve whoever it is that you're managing money for. I also like to say, hey, look, sometimes when people are struggling with, what do I do first, second, third, whatever it is? Well, sometimes maybe you orient around a calendar. When are taxes due? Are people making quarterly payments? Are you filing your taxes on time? Those sorts of things. Other pieces is, are there mandatory payments or expenses that have to be done at a particular time? I've had a few families where individuals that are put in the role of being responsible to manage money for somebody else for the first time, they don't know where to begin. But boy, did it help to pull out a calendar and to be able to say, like, look, the 3rd week of every month, that's when I'm going to be paying all my bills, and the bills are these. And it helps, ground folks in things that might be easier and more bite-sized. Other pieces that I want to remind you is sometimes people have retirement accounts, IRAs, thrift savings plan, those sorts of things. And there are rules that are very calendar specific on, you got to take money out, a certain amount of money out. Those kinds of things where you got to take a certain amount of money out of those things are called required minimum distributions. You got to take at least a certain amount out. Those got to be done typically by the end of the year. So part of the idea is knowing from a calendar standpoint, maybe this is going to be a good jumping off point for knowing when exactly I have to act. I also get this question, which is like, look, I'm stuck. I recognize what the balance sheet is, what the cash flow statement is. I understand my responsibilities. People have accepted my authority, whether it's institutions or family members, but boy, I really don't know where to start. It feels overwhelming and everything feels urgent, feels important. Well, I'm going to be taking this next part of our presentation, talking about, look, there's a decision-making process that I think meets the fiduciary standard, not just for individuals, but this is the stuff that professionals use. I serve as a professional fiduciary in a lot of my roles with clients. People in my practice do. A lot of people in my industry do. Sometimes attorneys that get named as fiduciaries, this is the same process. And what I'll show you is it's pretty easy conceptually, and this might be a good place to get started if you ever feel stuck. This is basically how I organize it. It's the first thing that you need to do is get all your information in one place, organize yourself. We talked a little bit about writing stuff down and knowing money in and money out and so on. But if you think differently about before I try to make any decisions, before I try to evaluate my choices, I just need to make sure I got all the information in one place. And a pretty consistent mistake, if I was going to say, what are the mistakes that I see people make when they're managing money for somebody else? It's because they kind of did a ready, fire, aim. I acted without getting all the information organized in front of me. And if I knew the thing that I know now, I wouldn't have done the thing. Well, you can maybe save yourself some of that risk by organizing your information to begin with. Evaluating your different set of choices, formalizing a particular decision and a path, making sure you're executing on your decision, and then you're monitoring. Let me go through each of these in a little bit more detail. This is a bit repetitive, but these are best practices, and I wanted to give you this framework to think. Create a balance sheet. What a balance sheet is, for those of you that don't do a lot of finance work, it's basically a list of all your money. How much money do you have? How much money do you owe? And you have all that in one place. Organizing cash flow, recognizing that, money in, money out, getting an idea of which of these expenses, for example, are going to be pretty static. Like my mortgage payments, pretty static. The amount of withholding I've taken out of my taxes, well, that can be sometimes static. But what could change? And those are going to be the things for you as a fiduciary that I want you to just highlight, to be aware of. Healthcare expenses can change. A lot of times when we're managing money for somebody else, there is some attendant lessened ability, disability, or somebody is needing some paid assistance for. It isn't unusual for people to need more care and more expensive care as time goes on. So keep an eye on those expenses that could change over time. Compare that to items that's not going to change. Social Security is not going to change, notwithstanding some small cost of living increase and so on. And identify areas that can be simplified or consolidated. Sometimes just having a rolled up executive summary, the big picture, is the right sort of unit of analysis. So look for areas that, maybe you don't need accounts in 500 different places, maybe consolidating them into a fewer number of more manageable accounts. As long as you're keeping the title of the accounts the same, maybe that's going to be best for the person that you're caring for. So you also want to think about what happens if things change down some care. That individual, so I always want to think, listen, if you've got a couple and everybody's focused on the first spouse that needs some help and we got to manage money and so on, I always like to make sure that even though the care is happening to one person, the financial implications of the care can happen to more than one person. So I always like to make sure we're asking the question, is a widow or a potential survivor, are they going to have enough money after the death of an individual to maintain their standard of living? That's worth thinking about. And the idea of paying for quality care, what kind of changes might be coming down the road with a particular plan of care? So for example, a lot of times when people are receiving assistance for cognitive impairment, and people can live sort of semi-independently in a home setting for a while. Well, the nature of the disease for a lot of folks is their needs are going to change, and they might have to look at different settings or different levels of attention that are coming into the home, making sure that you're accounting for that possible change. And when I say formalize a plan, I'm always sort of saying, like, listen, think ahead, think around the corner. What outcomes are you kind of anticipating? The idea that the decisions you make now, you have to take account what are the kinds of changes that might be happening in the future. What happens if care needs increase? What happens if a primary wage earner, a pensioner, dies and leaves a survivor that is the one needing help? What happens if the market takes a big crash? Does that impact our ability to pay for stuff? Think ahead about, well, what are the different kinds of things that could happen? So in the moment, you're not reacting as somebody who's managing money for somebody else for the first time. Think about what outcomes you can financially weather, where is the risk. So I think it's a good exercise when you're going through creating a plan, trying to see, like, where are the weak links in the chain? Like, I'm really concerned if paying out of pocket for the cost of care lasts more than 18 months, because that means we're going to have to make some decisions about property or something. That can really help impact the kinds of choices that you need to make right now, so you're not painted into a corner under some things that you might not have thought about down the road. And I think executing, I get some positive feedback with, I'm going to start on the bullet on the bottom, is what's the new job of the money? It's sort of folksy sounding, but it's an easy way to understand it. Whatever the portfolio, the cash in the bank, whatever its job was before, if somebody new is managing money and expenses, particularly healthcare expenses, are now added to the mix, you want to sort of define it as a new job. I know that we need to have an extra $6,000 a month because we're dipping into our assets because we're paying money for care. The new job of the money is to have that $6,000 a month, in my example, as predictable as possible, as safe as possible, as long as possible. And that might be the dog that wags the tail about different ways you think about a portfolio or allocation or approach to the markets. So I ask you in the first bullet, does a previous portfolio, the way that somebody's money is set up, is that still the right way that money should be set up given the new job of the money? Does the old way that somebody was managing cash, moving money between accounts, is that still appropriate, or does that not really work anymore? Like, sometimes if the status quo can't be maintained anymore, then you need to change. This is an area where you as a fiduciary have the wherewithal to act. And the last one, and I think this is important, not everybody, but sometimes people have very modest amounts of savings relative to their longer term investments. I always like to have, as a rule of thumb, anywhere between 6 to 12 months worth of withdrawals in liquid reserves. And what I mean by withdrawals is, how much money do you need to dip in to your particular finances to pay for care, for example, and use my number, $6,000. I like to have at least 6 to 12 months of $6,000 pulling out of a portfolio in liquid reserves. And right now, with interest rates being a little bit higher, it doesn't hurt families the way that it used to, because you can actually earn some interest on having some liquid savings right now. But as a planner who's done this a lot, you want to make sure that you've got good liquid reserves that gives you some air in the brakes, some cushion for changes that might be coming. And I always come back to, like, well, what's the new job of the money exactly? So think about that when you're trying to figure out which is the right direction to go. I'm going to use only one kind of nerd word that's coming from financial services, and this has to do with working with professionals and working with financial advisors like myself. Working with an advisor, do you give that advisor full discretion, full control to manage money as they see fit, or is it something that, I as somebody that's managing money for somebody else, I still want to have a say. I still want some control. even though I'm letting the professional do other stuff. That's called non-discretionary. I'm not giving the advisor full discretion on stuff. Here's something to think about between hiring an advisor to do things totally for you versus doing something with you. The tax consequences of hiring an advisor, sometimes to do everything themselves, sometimes can damage a client. If the only way to work with a financial advisor is to gather a bunch of money, sell everything, and put it into their model portfolios, you as a fiduciary, you as somebody that's responsible for all of this, you might want to say, hey, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to pay a whole lot of taxes. Are there ways that we might be a little bit more tailored or customized to be able to do this? Because you're the one responsible, again, for best outcomes from the financial side of things. And I also mentioned, too, the idea of, sometimes people are in different roles and responsibilities for families in transition. Every family is a little bit different, but even though your story, you're experiencing it as sort of a unique circumstances, people still, generally speaking, a lot of times behave the same ways. It sometimes is useful to keep some control, to have line item veto power on investments when you're engaging financial advisors. And I always start at finish at the bottom. Let the fiduciary plan be the guide. Like, what's the job of the money? Everything should sort of serve whatever the job of the money is that you determine is in the best interest of the individual that you're helping out. And listen, don't let go of the decision maker rudder. Sometimes people that are managing money for somebody else have a dual responsibility of actually being a caregiver as well. So I'm always trying to be sympathetic for, listen, how much bandwidth wherewithal does somebody really have if they're taxed with so many different responsibilities? And maybe you can delegate some of this monitoring to a professional as needed. I always think that the idea of committing to a timeline to reorganize and start the process again, that's always a pretty good idea. Sometimes people ask me, like, well, how often should I be reorganizing? Well, it's usually one of two things. I think annually is a minimum. Every year, get everything together, redo your balance sheet, your expenses, your cash flow statement. Or when there's a material change, if income, expenses, market conditions, if there's a big change, it's time to go back to the top of this circle, reorganize yourself again, evaluate your choices, figure out your new job of the money, and so on. So I'm, as a financial advisor, somebody that does this for a living, I wanted to give you a few tips. Like, look, in the event that I need a professional as a qualified guide managing somebody else's money, maybe you have a relationship, maybe it's appropriate to scout out a new relationship. Let me give you a few tips about how to best use a financial advisor. I want you to think of it sort of in two categories. The first one is you could work with a financial advisor proactively, which is, hey, financial advisor, can you help me make a plan so I can start seeing around the corner in terms of what might be coming, and help me set the criteria to make financial decisions. I want to keep somebody safe. I want to keep as much money and liquidity available for the priorities that we had, independent of paying for health care. Show us a path, and you can work with a financial advisor to help map that out from where you sit moving forward. And everybody, it's like anything else, planning ahead. Of course, that's the best practice, but reality sometimes, comes in. Life is messy, and you have to maybe engage somebody like a financial professional reactively, which is a life event requires a complete realignment of goals. I have clients that share with me, listen, the stuff that used to be the most important thing that governed our financial decisions, those aren't the most important things anymore. It's now things like quality of care, dignity of care, staying near loved ones, those sorts of pieces. And all of a sudden you have a new hierarchy of most important things. Maybe a financial advisor could help. How do I navigate against plans that were beholden to old priorities with this new set of circumstance? And how do I kind of blend them together? Maybe I look at a financial advisor to help map out what the new hierarchy of priorities really means for the sets of decisions that I have to make that involve money, but might be about other things. I think a financial advisor, and this is true of a lot of great advisors in our industry, what they can do is they can tell you when, your behavior, the decisions that you make are kind of aligned with your goals. I can recall a number of different situations in my professional life where I've had to coach folks that, taking a whole lot of risk in stock market, for example, even though that was appropriate for the previous chapter, we're taking some risk with all of these different new expenses. Maybe you should make things a little bit more conservative. Is your behavior, is your sets of choices, does it align with sort of the new goals, your new job of the money? And sometimes a financial advisor can help qualify subjective priorities, which is, a lot of times people will use financial decisions for very personal reasons. I want to spend money to get the family back together, or I want to make sure that somebody feels financially supported. Like if you've got the authority to do those sorts of things through the document that you've got, maybe a financial advisor can help puzzle out what's the best way to make some choices against priorities that sometimes compete. And then the last one, a good financial advisor might be able to help you quantify benchmarks. Look, I'm happy for counseling some clients to be able to say, listen, I don't think you're going to run out of money. I don't think you have a huge margin of error, but you got to fine tune a few things over here. But these are the benchmarks. I want to make sure the portfolio is generating this amount of income. I want to make sure the portfolio doesn't have more than X amount of a loss, or we got to be a little bit more conservative along those lines. Sometimes a financial advisor can help be a coach or trainer by helping you establish what those benchmarks are. So sort of closing out the idea of what's our process. And this maybe could be your process as somebody that's responsible for managing money. Number one, I'm repeating myself because it's important. Before you act, before you do anything, organize all your information. Evaluate your sets of choices. What are the different things that you need to do? Formalize like a plan. Make sure you know the job of the money. Execute a plan. Move forward. What are the decisions that I have to make? Whether it's calendar specific or I really need to be more responsive to the new realities that we're living in. And I always have the idea of I'm monitoring and I'm checking to see what kinds of things need to change over time. And on an annual basis, or maybe when things change, start the process again. Try to prevent yourself from making decisions without having all the information in front of you, but also make sure that you move forward, particularly on decisions that you can change your mind on in a timely fashion and don't get sort of frozen in the moment. So this last piece, I sort of close on this, which is family members sometimes are positioned for the first time. They don't make any choices. They don't make any decisions along those lines. Remember, as a fiduciary, as somebody that's been named responsible party for managing the wealth of property of somebody else, like your standard of care is requiring you, when appropriate, to act. And if that's not you, if you need help, look for help and a qualified guide. And also, if it's just too much responsibility, maybe identify that early in your family situation and look for successors. Listen, maybe I need to hand the baton to somebody else. Does the document that gave me the authority nominate who might be backup? Those are kinds of things that you need to know what you can and can't do, either with or without assistance. So with those sorts of ideas, let me stop there. I'm going to let Allegra come back online and to be able to help manage some of the questions that we've got. We've got some minutes before we're breaking for the hour, so I'll give you the opportunity to ask questions.
Thanks so much, Tom. Great information. So audience members, please use the Q&A button to submit your questions. I know I saw a hand up, but if you could type, we're not going to have anyone come off mute on this system. But Tom, we do have a question that came in. So for a family of two without any family members to help settle an estate if something happened to both people, do you recommend any trust companies or who could help settle an estate if something happened to both people to execute their will, existing will, trust, etc.?
Mm-hmm. So that's definitely, thank you for the question. I think that is a good example where knowing to reach out to a qualified guide is another way that I'm hearing the question, Allegra. What you're really talking about is in the legal documents that are giving people authority to manage money, maybe after somebody dies, or if somebody is less able. I think that what you're asking, the Mr. Questioner, is what should be in the document, and like, do you recommend particular people to fill these roles if you only got a family of 2? So the answer is yeah, but that generally should be thought through at the time you're putting together these legal documents. So, the county, Legger's department's got a great list of trust and estate and elder law attorneys that do these sorts of things regularly, and they would be the qualified guide to be real specific on that question. And I'll tell you sort of a few different ways that I've seen those professions sort of answer and address that question. The first one is you could consider, professionals. All right, well, generally speaking, who might be serving that role? Sometimes attorneys serve that role. Rarely, but it does happen that you can have financial institutions sort of serve the role on the property side of things. Generally speaking, you want to have that stuff named in the document, particularly on the professional side. I also think it's not a bad idea that even if you're having professionals do it, different attorneys do this different ways, but is there anybody in your personal life that cares about you that might have the ability to swap out professionals if they're not doing right by you in the event that you're less able or you're dead? So talk to a qualified attorney about that. I like the question. What you're really asking for is who might be the qualified guide or who might step into that role. And the way you get there is by a thoughtful consideration of who's available in your personal life, who might have access to the information, who might have the capacity and the time and expertise to do it, and then to tag in professionals sort of as needed. But best practice is to do that in the drafting of the document stage. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Another question, is there ever a chance that I will be required to show my documentation of money management, of receipts, etc., to a court, lawyers, etc.?
Well, thank you for that question. The answer is yes. We live in a litigious society, and I want you to think a few things. The first one is, and it cuts a few different ways. The first one is, and Allegra and her department can speak to this. There's a lot of folks that need help on the financial side of things that aren't getting it, or are getting bad advice, or getting taken advantage of, and there aren't enough resources to protect all of the seniors all the time. That's the unfortunate reality that we're in. The reason I like your question, though, is there's a chance. Well, let's think about, who might be harmed. Who is everybody worried about if you gotta, you're subpoenaed to show all your stuff? Well, the first person is it in any way hurting or harming the person that you're supposed to be taking care of? That gets back to the fiduciary standard. That's why the reason that I say, like, listen, is a default setting. Let's have some good receipts and whatnot. There's all sorts of different caveats, though. Who are the people that are most likely to cry foul? Well, if you're the sole heir of one surviving parent, the person that would be most likely to report you is you. That's pretty unlikely. So, I think different family situations require different levels of diligence. There are absolutely situations that I've seen, children from previous marriages, elder financial abuse, where you've got strangers that are sort of in the mix. I do think that the idea that we are moving into a more litigious society, I think that the idea, when I'm giving you sort of best practices, somebody wants to know where I spent the money, here's where I spent the money, and this is why I spent the money, and this is the logic behind it. And the more buttoned up you are, meeting those standards that we talked about right at the beginning, I wouldn't be too worried. I think that the system is set up to try to support people that are doing their best, that are trying to pay attention. So I don't want you to feel like, super anxious about managing money for somebody else, as long as you take it seriously, do the things that you're supposed to be doing. The courts, don't assume or require, professional levels of everything all the time. I think that the idea of just having, listen, here's how I was trying to do my best and keeping records and not mixing money up with other folks. That's your best first line of defense, which is where I really emphasized it.
Thank you. Someone said a wife's Social Security goes into one account. The funds are not sufficient to cover the caregiver expenses. The other is paid from a joint account. Is this problematic?
It's not. Thank you for that. So the issue mostly has to do with having to spend more than is coming in. It's not problematic. It's just a layer of complication that's got to be specific to your individual house. Now, remember, if you're like a representative payee of that can change where your Social Security might be deposited, you want to ask yourself, is this something that absolutely has to be done? It might not. The idea of like, look, this is the way it's set up, and I'm keeping good records, and Social Security is sort of dropping in here, and I got to pull money from a joint account over here. This is sort of the hand I've been dealt. So at its face, there isn't anything particularly wrong with that. Where I would probably say, maybe there's an idea where you need to do a little bit more simplification. Imagine that like times 2, times 3. I've got pensions and Social Securities going into a whole bunch of different accounts. And then I got IRAs and distributions going into a whole bunch of different accounts. My practice has had to streamline and consolidate. You probably on this call, there's folks out there with 15, 20 different accounts and discrete cash flows. Like, well, that can be a headache. Complication isn't a problem in and of itself, okay? It's just something that needs to make sense. If things are extra complicated, like the way that you were setting your question up, Social Security isn't covering it, I got to go into another account. That's like level 1 complication. As long as things are pretty straightforward and easy to understand, I don't have any particular anxiety about that. Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier not to have a joint account. Can you explain further about why this is not a good idea? In particular, when the person who's being cared for has very little assets and is likely to need additional support from family members, wouldn't it be easier than setting up a trust or something similar?
Okay, thank you for that. So the issues with joint accounts, sometimes people and families that don't get professional advice, they will use joint accounts as kind of like a poor man's power of attorney, right? So grandma sets up a joint account with a local daughter, okay? And I don't go through the power of attorney, and both people on a joint account, they can move money independently in and out of stuff. If the joint account is set up without a clear and explicit expression of authority that like, no, even though I'm a joint account holder, I'm not acting as a joint account holder. I'm acting as somebody that is on a fiduciary level responsible for managing somebody else's money as compared to I'm just sharing in a particular account. You don't want to take a shortcut by using a joint account as sort of a cheap way to have access to money. And your question, I'm glad you sort of fleshed out, listen, if family members need to help, I think it's great that family members might be able to chip in, but the best practice is if you, who's on the, I'm going to say you who's asking the question, you're the one that's responsible. You're the one that's in the power, that says power of attorney. I would rather you have the banks and the siblings recognize the explicit authority that you've got and try to use existing accounts for if everybody needs to chip in, then maybe you transfer money directly into that joint account between, I'm imagining only one person, you and mom and whatnot. The other piece too, or you could do it in individual accounts as well, which I always think is cleaner. The other issue with the joint accounts, and this is something that sometimes people forget, this has to do with how assets are distributed after somebody dies. And the spirit of your question, and I believe you're trying to do the right thing and make it easy, but the spirit of the question is use the joint account just for ease of access. Well, I want you to remember that when somebody dies, joint accounts and whoever's titled on the joint accounts sometimes can, bejangle up the way money's distributed at death. And I'll give you sort of a quick metaphor. I want everybody to remember, like when we were growing up, or at least when I was growing up, those coin sorters where you put the quarter in and it goes by the dime hole and the penny hole and so on. I want you to think of that as a way to understand how money is distributed after somebody dies. So the will is the thing on the very end, like the quarter hole or the $50 hole. And that basically says, all right, I want to distribute money to my 4 kids evenly. And basically anything that hasn't transferred another way gets dumped into the will and gets distributed according to those instructions. But I want you to imagine that a well-intentioned child is operating a joint account. and the joint account has a whole lot of money, and this is where we're going to consolidate a bunch of stuff. Well, anything when that person dies goes directly to that other joint account holder. Any of that money doesn't distribute according to the instruction in the will. It just goes to one person who's on that joint account. And sometimes that cuts against the intent of how, in my example, grandma wanted all the money distributed, 25% to each of 4 kids. That's also going to be true of beneficiary designations. If you got an IRA or a pay on death account or something like that, it never makes it all the way to the will. So the joint account thing is sort of twofold. Unnecessarily easy way to express your explicit authority to manage somebody else, because it's not really the role you're playing. You're playing it as just a joint account holder. If you've got the authority, you want everybody to know you have that authority. But secondly, you might want to be cautious of using joint accounts for, in the event that your loved one dies, that might disrupt the intention of how money was supposed to be distributed.
Mm. A follow-up question to that, someone says, my wife has dementia. I have a durable POA. All accounts are individual, no joint. POA ends with death of wife, question mark. Should I make some of her money into a joint account to cover expenses upon death?
So all of the accounts are individually named. You've got power of attorney on that individual name. I don't think that you need to. So I'm going to repeat the question back as I understand it. So I'm just going to use my wife's name because it's easy to remember. So I've got a bunch of accounts in Beth's name. I'm power of attorney on Beth's accounts. I can use money in Beth's accounts to pay for Beth's stuff. And in the event Beth dies, the question is, am I in some way sort of compromised at that particular moment? So a few pieces.
Tom, they wanted to know if she dies, should they have a joint account set up so that they can use the money for the death expenses? Then
I understand. I think that yes, you can do that. But also just be aware of how those individual accounts, might transfer after somebody dies. So I like the idea of having some small, I'm fine with the idea of some small joint accounts for final expenses, 10, 15 grand, something like that. I think that's fine for ease of use. But it's also, I just want to remind you that, having money go from, in my example, Beth's individual account to Beth's estate account that could also be used for those final expenses, those usually only require a death certificate and a copy of the will or a pay on death. That's the only other thing that I might suggest. I might suggest to the individual taking the individual accounts and see if they would accept the financial institution would be able to accept a transfer on death or a pay on death. That would go directly to another account and would sort of bypass the need for the joint. But to the narrow way you asked the question, I think that the joint account could work like that for final expenses as well.
Thank you. If you are a durable POA for someone who is unable to make decisions and they have accounts with different beneficiaries, how do you make sure you draw from those accounts fairly to pay the person's expenses?
Ooh, that's such a good question. I think right there, to be honest with you, in terms of a CYA, that's where having an exact plan written out makes the most sense. It also, if you're also worried about a beneficiary feeling shortchanged, I think that the idea of being able to express exactly why and how you are pulling money from the different accounts, in my mind, I would probably say what seems fair to me would be taking distributions pro rata from the different accounts in different sizes. But my suspicion is if you got a bunch of different accounts, well, it's not quite that easy. The investments are in different places. Some of them might be in an IRA, might be different tax implications from withdrawals for each of them. So I think that's a really good example of when having a formalized plan that you're writing out could make a huge difference in making sure everybody sort of understands and accepts how stuff is going to be distributed. So the idea of maybe you're a good example of, I need a qualified guide to tell me how to write this stuff out, which is, we're going to be distributing on a pro rata basis, but we're not going to let any individual account fall below 10 grand or something like that, because it's, my loved one's intent that everybody gets something, or whatever conceit might be particular for you and your family. Just because, the speaker on the webinar came up with that on the top of the head on the pro rata side of things, that's not a substitute for having a good written out plan where you can explain the logic in terms of how you made some decisions about that. But that's a really good question. That's a tough one too. Look for a qualified guide.
Tom, thank you so much. It's 1 o'clock and I know you have to get going, so I will go ahead and end us here. So Tom, if you need to log off, you're more than welcome to. Thank you so much. And I know, folks, we still have more questions in the box, but we are at our time. Tom did provide a handout that has his contact information and how to get a hold of the office. Thanks, Tom. So, connect with us. We'll make sure you get that handout. And as you sign out, there will be that brief survey. So please share any comments that you would like me to share with Tom there. And let us know what you're interested in so we can continue to make programs that are, what you're interested for the caregiving community. And I want to invite you to our next caregiver panel. That's program models for loved ones living with dementia. That'll be Friday, September 29th from 2 to 3 p.m. And we're going to explore program models that are available to family caregivers who are caring for loved ones with dementia and are looking for resources and support for their loved ones. Again, thank you so much for being here today. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great. Bye, Allegra.